Hi there, Johannes Keating here. And this video is going to be me reviewing the case of the angry, childlike woman from 1978. So this is a Davila transcript, obviously vintage Davila from very early on, but I believe that there is a tremendous value in studying this particular transcript. And I find it fascinating that at the end of it, when Davenlu is dialoguing with his colleagues, he shares that he feels very positive towards the patient. And it's also interesting that Dr. David Malin shares that from his point of view, the patient in question struck him as the most sincere person he's ever met. So I thought that was really fascinating. Anyway, there is so much to glean and learn from Davinu's work. I think the earlier transcripts are incredibly fascinating, and I think that he was also really onto something that maybe, just maybe, got a little bit lost later on in his career. So I hope that you will enjoy this as much as I am. All right, let's get into it. So here we are, the case of the angry, childlike woman. This article was published in 1978, but the article can also be found in, I think it's the Basic Principles book from 1980. There's two books from around that period, and I can't actually remember which one. But if that's important to you, reach out to me and I will dig into it and find out. So, this is the case, and here Davenlu describes, or he introduces the patient rather, and some of her chief complaints. She complained of depression, problems in interpersonal relationships, characterized by passivity, dependency, wanting men to tell her what to do, and resenting it, and so on. So you could read that through if you want the full scoop. The patient says, I feel lost, out of touch with myself. Therapist, can you describe what that is like? Okay, can you describe what that is like when you say you're out of touch with yourself? Right here. Okay. Operating principle. Asking for clarity in the form of greater specificity and elaboration. And this goes to trying to establish the shared dream that I like to talk about. I made a lot of comments about that in the other recording about the case of the German architect. But in case you're watching this one first or you want a refresher, this is about Davenlu wanting to be able to picture in detail what the patient is talking about. The request also represents a low grade, mild pressure on the defense of vagueness. Davenlu goes on to seek further clarification. So you mean by this, you mean that. I think that's down here on page 248 somewhere. But this is his style of working. He's just trying to get clear. What are you trying to say here? Are you saying this? Well, that's vague. What do you mean by that? Oh, you mean that? Okay. So he's trying to establish a shared dream where he can picture in no uncertain terms, with crisp clarity, what the patient is talking about. Okay. So we see a tremendous effort from Davenlu to understand the patient's conscious frame of reference, to understand what the patient really means from her own subjective vantage point. So this conveys that he's taking her seriously and that he's more interested in understanding her as opposed to laying a trip on her. He's not devaluing the conscious mind in favor of the unconscious. This is a really important point. Notice the great care he's taking to actually understand her first person subjective conscious vantage point, her views. What is she really saying here? Okay. He is not skimping on that in favor of accessing the unconscious. This is very, very important. Now, on page 248, he asks not for one examples, but a few examples. See right here? Could we look at the things that you do and you don't know why you do them? Give a few examples of the things that you do and you don't know why you do them. Okay? So the operating principle is to gather more data. It's to cast a wider net. Because in only looking at one example, well, then you only have that. But if you have a few of them, you might get a bigger picture with more clarity. Okay. Now, the bottom of this page, 248, the patient herself, she identifies her vagueness. And then Davenlu joins her there and asks if she prefers to be vague. Notice the emphasis on ownership. She prefers to be vague. Not that there is some disembodied part of her that is vague, but she actually is the one preferring it. Also notice that in the same paragraph as Davenlu speaks to her vagueness, he asks about her will to look into why she wants to be vague. Quote, and that we have to see why it is that you prefer to talk in general, vague terms rather than to be specific. This is then followed up with, are you often vague rather than specific? So this highlights how Davenlu, well, how focused he is on trying to turn the patient against her defenses. So page 249 here, the patient refers to her vagueness as a defensive thing, suggesting some awareness of its function, doesn't it? So this is a good sign, and it suggests an activated unconscious therapeutic alliance, in my opinion. As soon as the patient identifies it as a defense, Davenly goes straight into a head-on collision. Okay, right here. The immediate question we have to raise for ourselves here is that you say being vague and talking in general way is a way of avoiding dealing with the core of the problem. Now, if we continue in this session to deal with it in a vague and general way, then we have defeated the purpose of the interview. So why then should we defeat it from the beginning, since obviously you must have difficulties for which you want to get help. But then you set it up in a way that it's going to be defeated from the very beginning. Do you see what I mean? Okay, so that's the head-on collision. So the reason is that the patient herself has identified her vagueness. She herself has made it clear that she understands that it has a defensive function. And so that's really the beginning of the defense crystallizing. You know, she is conscious of it. She's aware that it's a defensive strategy. She's not identified with it. She's not saying, well, this is just who I am. This is how I am. What do you mean? It's normal. She's not saying that. And so that gives Davenlu the latitude to launch a head-on collision. And page 250. Davenlu, you may not know it exactly, but are there other... Okay, so he meets her where she is, right here. See this piece right here? You might not know it exactly, but you might have some sort of ideation about it. For example, are there any other life experiences in which you want to be treated like a child? So, in my opinion, he's meeting her where she's at by saying, okay, I understand that from your current state of mind, your current vantage point, this is unclear to you, but let's see what we can do here, kind of a thing. And then the patient goes, I think in any intimacy I am, in any relationship. And then she goes, with a man particularly, with women friends too, to a certain extent, but not always. Okay. So, Davenlu, this is the pattern or style with your relationship with men. You let them run your life and treat you like a child. With women to a lesser extent, but it's a similar pattern. The operating principle, again, is that he's bringing into bold relief the exact nature of the pattern that is being identified. This is anchoring the understanding so that it is cemented and sort of crystallized between them. It goes again to the shared dream. Like he's staying so close in on the patient's experience. He is snug. And this is very, very central to how Davenly works. Now, over here on page 251. There's an emphasis on that the patient wanted to be used, that she was the architect. She set it up. And at the end of this page, notice how Davenlu circles back to the patient's earlier reference to her father, asking about the nature of her relationship to him, both in the past and the present. So the operating principle is he's exploring how the pattern of passivity and taking a used and abused position operates on all corners of the triangle of person. And he's capitalizing on the patient's collaboration, on the fact that the patient herself introduced the link to her father. The other operating principle is that given how collaborative the patient is, and given that her defenses are not yet bringing the session to a halt, where there's no productivity, Davenlu continues with inquiry. He is milking that face for what it's worth. So defense clarification and the head-on collision, it's been sprinkled in. But again, given the patient's responses, psychodynamic inquiry, which, by the way, also contains elements of soft pressure, it remains productive. So if Davenlu had not determined that the session was still productive, he would not have asked about her relationship to her father, for instance. Page 252. So, oops, go. Even though the patient refers to being, quote, terribly resentful, end of quote, notice how Davenlu does not prioritize pressure to feeling. Instead, he prioritizes the question, in what way is he bossy? Okay, in what way? Right here. Okay. She's just said, I'm terribly resentful. But she's not prioritizing, so what's the feeling or how do you experience it? He's not doing that. Now, the patient's response to this is again vague, which Davenlu highlights, and the patient readily agrees with this. The patient then provides specificity, dropping her vagueness. Now the shared dream, it has resumed, and Davenlu moves on to gather a good deal of more historical information, which in and of itself is significant. The fact that the patient dropped her vagueness and became clear and specific, and that this was followed up with more inquiry, highlights something important. Okay? One, as long as defenses are not interrupting the shared dream, meaning the clear, direct, concise, undefended sharing of personal and intimate information, inquiry continues. Two, by taking the time to actually get to know the patient, he's again conveying the message that he's taking her seriously. You know, when therapists jump straight into major mobilization with pressure, they skip the stage of actually getting to know the patient. And that, in turn, gives the patient reasonable cause to be resistant. In other words, you don't even know me and you're pressuring me like this? Like, why would I want to open up to someone who doesn't even take a few minutes to get to know me better? Okay? That's a really critical point. So still here on page 252. At the bottom of this page, Davenant brings the pattern into the T by asking if it is in operation with him. Okay. So this reflects something significant. You know, this means that the element of her passivity of waiting for Davenlu to drive the session, it has been in operation from the start, okay, but it has not sufficiently gotten in the way of the session. There was some passivity, but it did not get in the way of meaningful, psychodynamically significant information being uncovered. So only when Davenlu feels he's gotten the mileage he can without more forcefully addressing the defense, only then does he shift gears and return to her passivity. The unconscious alliance in the form of spontaneous, meaningful collaboration was also clearly in the picture. So it wasn't just vagueness and passivity, it was a mixture. So operating principle. avoiding perfectionism when addressing defenses, not catastrophizing the presence of some passivity, steering clear of either or thinking and addressing the defense really only when it's getting in the way. And the other thing here, we saw Davenlu taking a stepwise approach, highlighting the defense early on and then moving forward. When the patient was clear on the defense and its function, he head-on collided, but without getting stuck there. The pattern we saw was he's touching on it and then moving on, and then revisiting the passivity as it's needed, only returning when it becomes a significant barrier to progress. That's the pattern. Davenlu continues gathering historical material and concludes the session by framing the patient's internal struggle within a binary framework, the battle between resistance and the desire for change. He foreshadows that this dynamic will be a key focus in treatment. And then, as I mentioned in the introduction, on page 260, which is this one, I found this pretty interesting here. You can read it over yourself, either here or accessing the actual article. But it was really interesting to hear his commentary and that he felt very, very affectionate, very positive towards the patient. And then here, which I also mentioned in the introduction, Dr. David Mallon, he said, I'll just read this bit since it's short, but I'm very interested in the market polarity in response to this patient. I had a most intensely positive reaction to her. I thought she was basically one of the most sincere people I have ever seen. My reaction to her was like Dr. Davenlu's. The degree of polarity is most extraordinary. Okay, so this is more of an overview, broad strokes, but I hope it gives you some inspiration to dig in yourself. All right, that'll do it for now. Take care.